Well, it was a law passed more than a century ago, effectively banning French language teaching in Ontario. Regulation 17 was in effect for just over a decade. Now, Ontario's Premier is apologizing for that decision. Here's Kathleen Wynne yesterday speaking at Queen's Park.
Regulation 17 prohibited primary schools from using French as a language of instruction or communication beyond grade 2, allowing only 1 hour per day for French to be taught as a subject in primary schools. Aujourd'hui, au nom du gouvernement de...
Today, on behalf of the Government of Ontario, I present apologies to all Franco-Ontarians and their communities, those that suffered because of Regulation 17.
For Franco-Ontarian identity and equality, and on behalf of the Government of Ontario, I offer an apology.
That's the Premier speaking in the legislature yesterday. For more on Regulation 17 and its impact on Franco-Ontarians, I'm joined by Alain Dupuis, head of the Regroupement, étudiant franco-ontarien, a group representing Francophone students in the province. Welcome, Alain. Merci. Thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you.
So what was Regulation 17, or more importantly, what did it mean for Franco-Ontario children?
Well, Regulation 17 was enacted in 1912 and was I guess, applied until 1927, and it effectively banned the use of the French language in Ontario schools. And between the 1850s and the turn of the century, there was an important migration of French Canadians from Quebec to Ontario to establish farms and to work in the wood industry and mining in northern Ontario. And the Premier at the time, James Whitney, thought that that was a problem and that there would be a French Canadian invasion of the Ontario territory, so that he had to ban the use of French. And for my ancestors, that meant going to school afraid that the public school inspector would come and possibly shut down their school, take away their teacher's teaching license, or cut school funding if they weren't teaching in English. So most of the time that meant that they would only learn in English, and it caused the assimilation of a whole generation of Franco-Ontarians, unfortunately.
When you put it like that, it's an incredibly hurtful and harmful 10 years law. Some teachers, though, I understand, ignored Regulation 17. Can you tell me about that, and how did the province respond?
That's it. Well, that's the flip side of the story. It's also a story of, cultural awakening for Franco-Ontarians. It's really seen as a moment where Franco-Ontarians said, no, we belong to Ontario. This is the land that we've chosen where we want to bring up our families. And here in Ottawa particularly, there was École Gig that we still see here in the market, where the teachers actually resisted and took off their hat pins. And there's a very important moment that's called La Guerre des Épingles, the War of Pins, where those teachers resisted the inspectors coming into their school with their hat pins and chased them away. So there was that important resistance here in Eastern Ontario, but if you go to Southern Ontario, there was less of that resistance, and the Regulation 17 was applied much more thoroughly. And in Northern Ontario, it was more of a, well, when the inspector would come, we'd hide the textbooks in French, and we'd do as if we were teaching in English. So it's kind of it's an interesting story, but it has left, unfortunately, scars for the Francophone community. There are a lot of Ontarians that have French names today that don't speak French, and that didn't get that heritage or that language.
It's for some, though, and I don't mean to play the devil's advocate, but I will. Some might call this ancient history. I mean, it was done, it was a decision, it was wrong, but it was a long time ago. Why did the way French was taught continue to matter? Why was the impact continue to be felt?
Well, it's because French was not passed on in a lot of families after Regulation 17, and there was this kind of guilt associated to being a Francophone in Ontario, and unfortunately that was felt from generation to generation. But today we can say that we've come back from that situation. We have 450 schools, French language schools in Ontario. We have 12 French language school boards. We have 2 French language colleges. Today in Franco-Ontarian education, what's really missing is a Franco-Ontarian university, because at the university level we only have access to about 22% of programs in French.
I thought University of Ottawa was a bilingual institution.
It is, but not all programs are offered in French, and it's not an institution that's governed for and by francophones. And if you look at schools or colleges, francophones actually do decide what their education will look like, but we don't have that governance power, let's say, at the university level yet.
And in terms of what is actually available, because we live right here on the Quebec border, I mean, people obviously could go to university over in Gatineau or Montreal or Quebec City or anywhere else,
That's
right?
it.
But that's different from having one right here in your hometown.
It is, definitely. And I'm from Sudbury, and I had to move to Eastern Ontario to study in my language. And 9 years later, I have not gone back to Sudbury. And a lot of students from Northern and Southern Ontario have to move here to Eastern Ontario to study in their language. And that means the weakening of our Francophones communities elsewhere in the province.
You talk a little bit about the generational impact. Can you talk about what happened in your family?
Yes, well, my great-grandmother that I had a chance to meet before she died actually went through Regulation 17, and she talked about how she was her whole life more... she could better read and write in English than she could in French, and she kind of had that guilt her whole life that, you know, it's her culture, but she didn't have full access to it, and that, you know, she'd go to school and exactly what I just described, that the inspector would come and it would kind of be like a fire drill where you had to switch your textbooks for English language textbooks, and the teacher would start speaking in English, and I can understand that could be quite traumatic for a young child to live that and to say, well, why is my culture a second-class culture and a second-class language? So I think that the apology is an important one, to say that we recognize that Ontario's not always been an open and just society for everybody, but there's still a lot of work to do, and let's look ahead, and the French language is here to stay, and we're here to build Ontario with everybody.
Your great-granny would have been very proud of the work that you're doing, Alain.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for coming in this morning.
Thanks.
Alain Dupuis heads up the Regroupement, étudiant franco-ontarien, a group representing French language students in the province. This is a conversation I've had with a number of people. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Are you Franco-Ontarian? Is your family? Did Regulation 17 affect you? Email us, ottawamorning@cbc.ca, or tweet us at